In this video we will talk how can we create our custom buttons, and for me the necessity for these became when I wanted to kind of take this lab symmetry node and actually create buttons that's going to change where our pivot is going to start. So I did is basically just a simple setup that's going to basically switch between three positions for my pivot. Basically the custom one that I can move around as I want. The bounding box one is going to basically take this bounding box and going to mirror it right at the middle of it, like that, and align grid to the center of the grid. So let's just take a look how can we make it. It's basically just this pretty simple setup with a little bit of Python, and I'm definitely not saying this is the only way we can do it. It's just the way that I have got it working. So I hope you learned something, and let's get to it. Let's start by checking a little bit about. Let's start by the very basics before we actually start any button referencing. Before we actually create any buttons for our HTAs, let's start with the Python node. So this is gonna talk a little bit about the basics concept of the Python inside Houdini. So you put down the Python node, make sure it's in Geo, and there's going to be a couple of things. You can see there's already written a little bit of code inside it. So you can see there's a variable called node and Geo. So for Geo, let's not worry about it right now, but for the node, there's actually a function in it. It's pwd. So basically this function is referencing this node inside it. So let's make sure that we can use a print function. Let's print out this variable node like that, and that's it. You can see inside Python shell, if you take a look at, make sure you have open Python shell, it's going to print out Python 1. Basically this is the reference to this node, which is pretty important because we can basically modify this code to reference any node wherever we want. So this is basically a shortcut for us to reference this very node that we want to change any variable inside here and do things that we need to do with this node. It's because with Python we could set up render flags, but of course Python has to know which node that we want to do it in. So this is very useful way, very simple way for us to reference this very node that we are actually writing inside it, like that. And what you can do is also use .path. You see, it's going to basically print out the path of this node like that. For us to understand why this node.path worked, we have to understand a little bit about Houdini and Python implementation. So first of all, anything that we write inside this is for the Houdini specifics is inside who module. Basically, it's Houdini module for the Python. Since Python is much larger than Houdini, it's basically a language, and for it, and basically SideFX has created a special module. It's who module that has all of these functions inside it. This is basically our entry to basically it's like a key for the Houdini that we can talk with it in Houdini language. We can make Houdini do anything. You can change the render flags and basically anything as long as there's a function for it and it allows us to change it. So imagine the who dot basically kind of like an entry to the world of Houdini through Python scripting. Let's just quickly take a look at why we're writing things as we are writing in Sen. Maybe do a little bit more if you don't really know anything about Python inside Houdini. Just give some clarification and maybe get you interested in Python inside Houdini, because it is incredibly powerful. It's something that I always kind of ran away from, but I think it's very worth the time to invest and learn. But let's take a look at it. So first of all, inside this node you can see it's basically pwd Houdini module, and let's take a look at inside Houdini help and just search for pwd. You can see it's basically going to return. It's basically going to talk what it is and what kind of an object it is actually class is going to return. So this pwd, since we printed it out as a node, you can see it does return something. It's basically return this node. But inside Houdini, you can see for the most of these, they should return something. You can see it's going to return who.node class. It makes sense because this is a node and this is a sub node inside geometry. We do, and you can see that there's a lot of different nodes inside. So what you can do is you actually take a look at what type of node it is actually. So put down node.type. You can see it's going to say that it's a sub node type. Let's go back to the help, and for us to access this kind of specifics for our sub node, we have to know what kind of information we can actually get from this sub node. Let's go to the help and let's go to the sub node, sub node. You can see in this next one we have used inside the fx is basically node.geometry. You can see it's in a very first method there's a geometry. You can see in basically it's a method, but for me it's more of a familiar with the functions. So inside Python it's basically called methods, but methods and functions basically interchangeable. And now you will notice that this geometry method is actually returning who.geometry object. So in Houdini, anything that is VRight is basically an object. So I'm not going to really go into it. So let's just go take a look at it. So this who.geometry basically talks about what this basically for everything that we would want to do with our geometry and all of the methods or functions that we can use it. So let's take a look at it. So first of all, let's put it on a box and let's connect it to the first one. And let's actually disable this one and let's do something else. So let's print out all of the points in it. So print, and now we have this. So we have our variable to reference this geometry inside here. So all we have to do is geo that point like that, and you can see we have now referenced all of our points inside this geometry. And let's delete this one and let's actually create points. So why we know that we can use this geo.points? Well, it's easy because we are now inside our who.geometry class, and if you go inside here, let's say points, there should be a function or method for the points. It's basically going to return the points of this geometry. What we can do is also create points. Let's just write geo.createPoint like that. Now you can see we have basically a 1 point right at the center of our grid. So this is just a concept that shows that how Houdini and Python works, that we have to be at the right, we have to reference right object for the right method in it. So hope it makes a little bit more sense now. So that's that. And you can see that this create point, let's go to the, actually I'm at the sub, so I have to go back to the geometry, who.geometry, and let's create point. So you can see it's going to now going to create the who.point class. And now that we have this point, we can go and use any of these methods for it. And of course the point has a different kind of a method than we have for geometry or vertex. So basically it's all dependent on where you are at it. So we can do different things with different objects. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense now. And now let's actually start play around with how can we reference channels in it. So what I have actually done is basically a little bit of a preset for myself. So this is probably the most common things that we might want to reference it with the buttons or whatever. So we have a float, we have int, we have vector2, two values, but as a one, basically in bundle of two values, because it is a little bit different. How can we reference them? And there's a vector3, basically 3 point in space, and also a string that it expects some words in it. There's a toggle and my button. So let's just take a look how can we start referencing channels and all of that good stuff. And to recreate this one, just go to the up in here, edit parameter interface, just start dragging some of these values inside here and rename them so that you know what kind of a what we are actually referencing. So, and you should be good. So just make sure that you have something like this if you want to follow up. So first of all, let's start with my button. So let's go back to the interface parameter. Let's say let's start with very basic. So let's say I want for my button to change actually there's something in it, so let's delete it. So for my button to actually change my float value. So let's say I want to press this button and this value is going to be 1. So let's start writing something in it. So for us to do it, it's basically in this callback script. Let's start writing it. So what we have to do is, first of all, we have to reference this node because it makes sense for us to do it. So it's just like in here, who.pwd, and now let's start with we have to reference the parameter. So for the single parameter, it's going to be a parm. So how do we know that? So let's go to the who.pwd. Let's go back to the and now that we are inside the node and we know it's a sub node. Let's start by parm. So you can see it's a parameter. So it's the parameter to the given path. So we are now basically asking for the parameter that we want. So basically now we want to reference the parameter. So what we have to do is it's a reference of parameter is always going to be a string. What we have to do is a name of our parameter. So we want to my float. So inside the quotes, my string, my float, okay, my float, sorry. And what we will do is put down since we do not want to, since we know that are in our parameter, what we can do is actually set it. So set, and inside the brackets, set it to the, say, 3. Apply, and let's take a look at it. So you see, now I press my button, it's called the script, and it changes the my float to the parameter to 3. And again, we can very easily follow this kind of a path of this. So now that we have pw, we have in our subnode. Now that we have called the parm, let's go to the parm. You can see there's a parm method. We use parm. As you can see, it's going to return who.parm class. And this class, we use this set. Let's find the set. You can see, and there's a set method for it. So basically, this is what kind of a path that we used and set this tree. So what's cool about this? Let's set it to the maybe 3.5. Apply and let's change it. You see it's also going to be 3.5, but let's say we want to reference to our int. So my int instead of my float, let's reference my int like that. Apply. You can see we're gonna get the error because this my int is not actually, it's only interested inside full integer values, and since we are giving it a float, it's not actually going to round up any number. So yeah, so let's delete maybe 3 like that. Now as long as it's a whole number, it's fine with without fractions, it's fine with it. And actually maybe there's a casting for it. So let's try out 3.5 and actually cast it as a int. Does that work? Okay, it does work. So you could also cast it as an int. So basically we write inside it what kind of a we want to cast it as. Let's say you want to cast it as a integer with int. You can see it's actually going to work. So 3.51 is probably going to round up to the 4. Okay. Oh, I guess it just basically cuts out the fractions. Let's take a look at it. Let's change it to 7. Okay, it's basically going to cut out anything that doesn't do any rounding. It's just after the 3 is going to cut off it. So okay, you could actually, well, it's not with the casting, you can actually do it. So yeah, so that's that. Little bit of course, so there. So let's take a look at other examples. Now that we have done with our floats and ints for the single values, let's take a look at the strings. So For strings, as you might imagine, it's actually going to ask for the string value, and we can't actually set it as a integer or as a float. So let's go to the from my int to my string. So let's put in a float for now. Let's try out my button. You can see it's going to complain that it's gonna set the string param to a float. So obviously we have to, if you really want to 3.4 in it, we have to do in the quotes like that. Now you can see we are writing in, we can write in whatever we want in it. It's going to basically paste inside my string. Now that we looked up the very basics of of setting up a single value, let's take a look how can we set up the vectors, or they're basically where in under one parameter there's multiple values, and so for that we actually have to use a param tuple. So let's start with the same setup, but this time let's use a param tuple. So let's take a look at it at the class. So we know that basically we are now at the who.sub node, and what we want to do is param tuple. So I just search for it. There it is. As you can see, it's going to return the param tuple object. So once we're inside it, we know that this param tuple, we have to give it a parameter path in it. So for the path, we know that these two values are basically vectors 2 and 3. So let's give it a vector 2. It's my vector 2, like that. And now that we are inside it, let's take a look at it. It gives a, instead of who.parm class, it's going to who.parm tuple class. In here, let's basically use let's take a look at it. So we can get the name of it. So we can actually return the parm tuple, the name of it. So what we can do is actually check it out. Let's try it out. So let's just copy this one, and let's just print out inside our console the name of it. So let's print it. Who.myvector2 dot. So what was it? It basically was a name. That's just a name, like that. Let's take a look. As you can see, name of the parm tuple is myvector2. And now let's set some values to it. So for the parm tuple, in help you can see it's basically the same method as with the who.parm. It's a set. So let's set it as a like that, and then just one thing you have to know that it does have to be in brackets. So since this is the two values, but it is the same, this is the same parameter. So one bracket, uh, and then another one. And in these brackets you want to write in your values. So since we have two values, let's 1 and 2 applied. Press the button. You can see now we have changed it to 1 to 2. So let's say now we want to change it to the vector 3. Let's go to the instead of 2 to 3. Applied, change it. You can see we're gonna get error because we don't have a 3 values. Let's do 3 values. Applied, change it. You can see we are now changing 1, 2, and 3. And one thing to note that since this parameter that we want to change is my vector 3, which is actually an integer vector, so we cannot give it decimals. So remember that it's a full. So if we start writing as a set a float like that, it's going to error out. So like that. So we could typecast it, or we could just use the float vector instead of integer vector. So make sure that basically a right data type for the right parameter. So make sure that we can't just start writing strings in it, so it's not going to work. So that's that. Let's make it to the one back. And for the last thing, I wanted to talk a little bit about how can we set up our expression functions, and how can we actually, let's say, copy the references from different channels inside this one. So let's say I want to bounding box for this node in this with the button click. Let's say I want to make sure that one of these buttons is going to say make it the default 0, and the other one is going to basically put in an expression that going to take the bounding box values. So how can we actually start writing inside the expressions in these vectors that actually, for now, that we know only takes integer values? So how can we start writing expressions in it? So let's take a look at that one. And now what I did is delete all of my code inside here. Let's just start with a clean slate, and let's start by, as you know, if you start writing any of these parameters, we can start writing it, and it's going to automatically pick it up as a expression. You can see on top of every node there's an option to select which kind of expression language it is. For us, we're gonna put it to the H script. So by default it's going to be H script, and if you see in my videos I always copy the reference channels, and these are basically H script reference channels. So for me it's going to be H script, but also we could write a Python code in it and just make sure that we have a Python here that's going to evaluate any of these expressions as a Python. And also once we start writing our code, we can actually specify maybe this particular one is a Python or H script that we are writing inside expression. So let's get to it. Let's start writing inside my button. So first of all, let's start the same way that we started with who.pwd. After that, we want our parameter. So let's start with a single parameter. So let's do a parm. Let's get my string. Actually my float. That's fine. Now what we have to do is use a different method. So first of all, we use the set, but now we have to use the set expression. And you can see with set expression there's a couple of things. First of all, we have to give it expression that we want to write inside our parameter, and there are a couple of default values. So whenever you see this equals none or true, basically it's default value, and we do not have to give different values for these, because these are basically default values, and if we are fine with these values as is, we do not have to write them in for our method to work. So let's check it out. So set expression. So and all we have to do is give it what we want to write inside. So remember in quotes, let's write in this is a test, like that. Apply. Let's check it out. So my button, you can see now we have written inside it, and by default it's going to be I think it's going to be H script. But you can see for every node there's actually option for us to evaluate it as H script or the Python. Another thing that I want to talk about is actually that we can actually reference individual vectors with this parm. So remember, we use parm tuple to basically reference all of these three values, but what you can do is actually reference one of them. So if you take a look at it, basically the parameter is called, let's take a look at this vector tree. The parameter is called my vector tree, but obviously it has three values, and they are my vector 3x, y, and z. So what we can do is actually use the same parm method, but use the actually just reference the single value of, let's say, my vector tree. Let's write my vector tree, and let's say x. Apply and take a look at it. You can see we are now in x. You can do with x, y, and z. And what's cool about this, you can actually write in more than this. So obviously this is not the optimal way to do it, but what you do is select all of it, copy, and after this line, put down a semicolon, and write it and paste this one. This is a test also, like that, and let's just, in the second one, let's reference not the x, but the y. Applied, and take a look at it. You can see we have called back the script, and basically using the parm method, we have written in two of these. And obviously, if you want to do is, I mean, this is not the ideal way to do it, but you can do it if you want. And let's also write it into z. You can see we have now with the same parm, just with basically the 3 times the same expression, we have written all of these. And now for the last part, let's take a look at how can we paste in a parm tuples as a, like from the expression into the new parameter. So I did a little bit more different setup. So basically we have two buttons, and what we want to do is basically, let's say you have something like a clip node, and you want to, let's say you want to clip the object from the centroid or from the bounding box or from the certain point on a grid, let's say at the 0 point of the grid. So what we can do is actually create two buttons. It's going to change the pivot position. So for now, there's not going to be any pivot, but I think I'm gonna make an intro video where I'm gonna show it. So basically, for this vector tree with these buttons, we're gonna reference either centroid or the bounding box of any object that we want. So let's set it up. So first of all, there's a little bit different setup for me. So first of all, I created my vector tree. For me, it was actually the integer vector, but since we are working with decimals, so make sure that it's actually a integer. It's a float vector. So I changed it to float vector, and I created two more float vectors, and I wrote in range scripts for the bounding box and for the centroid. This is basically just making sure that we have different values that are going to change as we move around this object. So what we can do is actually, let's print this and let's go to the box. You can see once we're starting to move this object, we are changing the centroid and also the centroid and the bounding box. So let's start working on this. So first of all, let's go to the help, back to the help, and first thing first, you know that for the expressions for this set, but with the parm we use the set expression. You would intuitively think that we have also the set expression for the parm tuple also. We actually don't have it, so what we have to do is use the set method, and we have to just give it a who.parm tuple object. So basically we want to reference our bounding box setup in here where we wrote in our bounding box h scripts, and basically paste inside in here, paste as a reference to this one. So what we can do is pretty easily. So who.pwd, after that parm tuple. So we want to in here write my vector. So it's going to be my vector tree, and then we want to set. And in help it basically says that you have to give it a who.parm tuple object. So what you can do is go ahead and take this, copy, and paste inside the set in parentheses. Instead of vector tree, we want our b box. So bounding box object parameter. And let's take a look at it, and that should be it. Apply it. Let's take a look at it. Press on it. So you can see we have copied it. It basically has copied channel reference to the bounding box of this one. But we have to take care of one more problem. If you, let's say, I always press multiple times one button, and let's say I press it again. You can see what it did is basically has copied the bounding box into basically this reference into this one. So basically it has copied it on one another. So now we have screwed up our references also. So this is one thing that we have to fix. We're going to copy this one and fix it back on our X also, like that. And now one time we can press it, it's going to be fine, but once you start to press it again, it's going to break it. So let's go back to the help. So in help is basically talks about follow parm references, and if you go down, you can see that it basically says that if we are referencing other parameters, basically going to copy this one into this one, and we have to actually, if we do not, and by default you can see it's going to set that to true. What we have to do is basically set it to the false. So what we can do is actually go inside here and copy this follow parm references, copy it, and after the bounding box, comma, and paste inside, and equals false, like that. Apply it, and you can see now. Let's clean out our channels. You see, I press it again, it's always going to be bounding box Y, and it's not going to go any further than that. So now we have fixed it, and we can basically change it. And now let's create another button for our center. So what I'm gonna do is actually copy this one and go to the center, paste it. So only thing that we have to do is so we want to copy it inside our vector tree, but want to add actually centroid. So it's called, for us it's centroid 2, like that, and everything else should be the same. So let's make sure we have a centroid 2. That should be fine. Applied. Let's take a look at it. So now you can see we have two buttons that are each copying different references to the one channel, like that. And one other thing, we can actually not write this whole follow parm references as long as we also do it in order. So let's go back to help. You can see there are one more parameter. It's not a parameter, it's called arguments. So in arguments for the language, we can actually set it. So by default it's going to be H script, and since these are H scripts, we are fine with it. But we can actually set up our language to the also to the Python. So let's go and do it quickly. So let's go back to the set. You can see for the language you have to give it a who.expression language object. If you open it up, you can see there's only two options for it's Python or H script. So let's say I want this to be copied. Let's say I have written inside this a Python and I want to copy it inside as a Python. So what I'm going to do is basically copy this who.expression language, copy it. Now let's go back to our bounding box, and after the pound tuple bounding box, you're going to paste it inside it, comma, and then follow parm reference. Applied, and let's press it bounding box. So you can see it now has become purple, so this is a Python reference. And what's cool about this, since we have done everything in order, we don't have to also reference this follow parm reference anymore. You can just write false, like that. Applied. See, we can write in false. So this is my end result that you saw in the start of the video. So I just go to the parameter interface. What I did is basically just switching between three buttons, and let's take a look what I actually did. So I had created two, let's show also invisible parameters. There are two invisible parameters, which basically, let's enable them and let's make them visible. There were a couple of limitations. So first of all, I did kind of a workaround with the label for the zeroing in on a grid, because let's say I first of all pressed on bounding box, and this basically gives the expression for my mirror origin, and we couldn't actually switch it. We could switch it to the another expression. We couldn't switch it to the another. Let's say I wrote in just a int value or float value. We could to the float. It basically has to be also the other expression. So that's why basically it's a simple expression. M0 is going to return a 0. So that's why I did kind of a workaround. And also there's a custom one. And for this one, let's take a look at this one. What I did is basically took this parameter, reference this parameter, and put down a delete all keyframes. And that's it. And basically I deleted all the keyframes, then did parm tuple, and then set it as a 000 integer values, like that, and that's it. And these delete all keyframes are actually inside, in help, in a set. I think it should be, parm tuple, it's set. It's set, there's actually, there this actually talks about, if this is not desired behavior, first delete the channel reference with the parm tuple, delete all keyframes, basically, and that's it. Basically we are deleting and then we are getting int values in it, and that's it. So I hope you found this useful, and tell me what you think about it, and there may be more Python things coming. So see you next time and take care.